Hi there, Steve here, Steve Kaufman. You know, we've had a lot of live streams, connecting with people who are under lockdown. We've talked a bit about how people use Link. I've had some conversations in some other languages, including my not very good Portuguese just now with in my last video with Gabriel. I don't apologize for it. It is what it is. If I were in an environment where I spoke Portuguese more often, I would improve. As it is, it tends to be very much influenced by my Spanish. But today I want to talk about the basics of language learning. Because, in many things that we learn, there's this sense that, the basics are very important. And I think the basics of language learning are important. I think the basics of a particular language are not so important. And that's my first basic concept. Your ability to master the basics, to learn the basic grammar, to learn the basic vocabulary, sort of up front at an early stage of engaging with a language, that ability is, I wouldn't say non-existent, but extremely difficult or rare. And the reason is that with languages, we are getting used to something. So some of the most basic things, we may not get used to them until 6 months later. And so one shouldn't worry about making mistakes in some of the most basic things. People who learn English make mistakes with a third person singular of the present tense. They don't put the S in there because they haven't gotten used to it. So learning languages is not about nailing down the basics. Learning languages is about getting used to the language. And we do that by acquiring words and phrases. That is the fundamental task. It's not trying to nail down grammar rules. Until we have enough experience with the language, those grammar rules are not that meaningful. If you are told that German is a subject-object-verb language, whereas English is subject-verb-object, that doesn't tell you very much, because until you're actually into the language, you really don't know what they're talking about. And you may theoretically know it, but you won't be able to reproduce it. And you won't necessarily be able to hear that or notice that when you're listening to the language until you have listened enough and read enough. And once you have listened and read enough, you will probably notice that. You will already notice it. And noticing is a big part of language learning. That is another basic concept. Most of the things we notice them without deliberately trying to notice them. We notice them because we come across them so often. The basic structures of the language, basic phrases, basic patterns, they repeat over and over and over again in a variety of different contexts. So we start to get used to them. Once you are used to some of these structures in the language, subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb, if you then go look at a grammatical explanation, then you may say, yes, I know that because I noticed that. And it's also possible that the grammar will explain some things that you didn't notice because we don't notice perfectly. All right? So words and phrases, you want to accumulate these words and phrases. The key activity for accumulating words and phrases is listening. You have to understand. If you want to eventually engage with people in conversation, watch movies, and so forth, you have to understand what people are saying. So you have to listen. Listen precedes reading. Because, first of all, the way I listen. There's a number of things I don't understand. Then I read the very same text, and that's very important. It's not that useful to listen to things where you only understand 10% and you have no hope of understanding the rest. So I listen, then I study the text on Link, I look up words and phrases, so that when I listen again, I understand a little more. I still don't understand the whole thing, but I'm gradually accumulating words and phrases. The advantage of listening up front is that it gives you momentum for your reading. Because when we read in a foreign language, we tend to sub-vocalize. So we have to know how the words are pronounced. And we don't want to rely, at least I can't rely on some kind of phonetic or, and particularly in a language where the writing system is not terribly phonetic, I need the assist of the listening. And in fact, we know that good reading skills come from good listening skills. People who have trouble reading, even in their own language, are people who didn't hear a lot of the language when they were young, or who have trouble hearing. Hearing, good listening leads to good reading. Good reading is where you pick up, and lots of reading is where you pick up the all-important words and phrases, and you start to notice them more and more. You noticed it once here, and once you've noticed it once in some listening or in some reading, you tend to notice it somewhere else, and then you notice it again while listening. And so there's a sort of a virtuous circle of exposing yourself to so much content that you start to notice things. Of course, a teacher may point certain things out to you, or you may notice by listening to, if I listen to myself speak Portuguese, I notice the mistakes that I make, and that helps me to notice again. And all of this is giving the brain a chance to get used to the language, because the brain is not very good at absorbing theoretical explanations. The brain is much better at creating linkages, recognizing patterns as it gradually gets used to a new language. For the brain to do that, because the brain is good at doing it, but it does it slowly, you have to feed the brain a lot of input, listening and reading. Now, in that listening and reading, it's important to have a strategy. This is another basic concept that I think is very important. You want to vary the repetition with the novelty. You cannot just push at the brain deliberate study, a list of words, grammar rules, conjugation tables. The brain starts to push back. It's bored. The brain needs new things. So when I start into a new language, I start with our mini stories at Link. I listen to them many, many times. The mini stories have a lot of repetition in them, a lot of high frequency verbs. But after a while, I'm bored. And that's where you have to push yourself into more interesting, new, challenging content. And as the brain gets better at dealing with this content, and it helps if you have online dictionaries, it helps if you're in a system like Link, you gradually are able to consume more and more interesting stuff from Netflix, from YouTube, from ebooks, audiobooks, wherever it may be. So you want to have a strategy that starts out with a lot of repetition and then moves into more and more interesting, challenging, new things to keep the brain happy. And when the brain does something that it thought was difficult and it exceeds its expectations, the brain is fired up, gets a kick of dopamine, and that's what you want to do. So basically that's what I wanted to say. I made myself some notes here. So get in the habit of doing a lot of listening and reading, and you will start to notice things, amongst other things, pronunciation. So we want to get away from expecting, that the way the language is written, and we may be used to how things are pronounced, say, in English, and we see it written, maybe this is a phonetic script for Japanese, but that's not how they say it. You have to hear how they say it. You have to get used to the intonation. If you're learning French, the intonation is a little more monotonous. If you're into Italian, it's more up and down, whichever language it is. And in Chinese, of course, you have tones, but you have to get used to that intonation, and you achieve that again through a lot of listening and reading. So there you have it. Those are my basics for language learning. Now, just as I said, there are no basics in the language. You have to go out and discover them gradually yourself. The same holds true for language learning. I have my basics of what I have discovered through my experience in language learning. You have to go out there and find your own path to language learning. See what you discover, see what you notice, see what are your basics. And once you have the language, you don't need the basics. And once you're experienced at learning languages, you don't need the basics. So that's what I wanted to say about the basics of language learning. Bye for now.